Major breaking news out of the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has ruled yet again for Donald Trump in his efforts to protect Americans from foreign invasion, specifically the Joe Biden era-based temporary protection status, which is really a form of amnesty granted to hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans. Guess what? Has just been shut down thanks to Donald Trump and, yes, indeed, the United States Supreme Court. You're not going to want to miss this discussion of how Trump has won again for America, thanks in part to the work of the United States Supreme Court. Stay tuned. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and I'm proud to say the top voice of the Second Amendment in America. Thank you, 2025 Gundies Awards. All right, folks, another huge win on Friday before the United States Supreme Court for President Donald Trump. Late in the day on Friday, the U.S. Supreme Court stayed, if you will, a lower court injunction out of California and the Ninth Circuit that basically said that Donald Trump's efforts as the President of the United States, as the leader of our foreign policy, as the commander-in-chief of our military forces, the lower Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals had said that despite all of that, Donald Trump was not able to shut down a Biden-era program that granted temporary protected status to hundreds of thousands, somewhere in the order of magnitude of 350,000 Venezuelans that were brought into America and allowed to stay here under Joe Biden. Supposedly because the conditions in Venezuela were the equivalent of an environmental disaster and an ongoing major war, constituting a humanitarian crisis that required the United States government and the American taxpayer to import hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans, all in the name of this temporary protected status or TPS status available under federal law for the president to step in, if he so chooses, and grant this kind of humanitarian relief on a temporary basis. Well, Joe Biden, of course, repeatedly allowed these Venezuelans to come to the United States, saying that there was a humanitarian danger to all of them in Venezuela, as opposed to the reality on the ground, which is, frankly, it's better to live in America than Venezuela. That I think we can all agree upon. But that doesn't mean that the entire world gets to move to the United States of America simply because our country is better than their crappy countries. It's just not the way it works. We cannot open the border up to everybody that lives in the world to move to America, because if we did so, we would no longer be America. If you import Venezuela to the United States, you become Venezuela. I think that's kind of how it works. And by the way, the founding fathers said this exact same thing. I think both Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton had this conversation, but that can be the subject of a different video on this very topic. But turning back to this big news today, the U.S. Supreme Court overruled the lower courts that had ruled against the Trump administration. The U.S. Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision, said that Donald Trump is the president of the United States. Donald Trump is the commander-in-chief. Donald Trump is in charge of American foreign policy. As a consequence, he gets to decide when temporary protected status is granted to foreigners, including, but not limited to, Venezuelans. And despite the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit decision and the District Court decision out of California that had ruled in favor of these hundreds of thousands of foreigners, placing their interest above the interest of American citizens, Donald Trump said just the reverse. He said, that's nice that Joe Biden allowed them to stay here for 4 years. They've had years in America. Good for them. Now it's time for them to leave. Now it's time for them to no longer be protected by this temporary protected status under the relevant laws, because both Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, and President Donald Trump says it's time for them to go. The humanitarian crisis that Joe Biden supposedly identified in Venezuela is no more. They get to go home. And of course, if they can't go home, maybe they can go to another country, but they cannot stay here. Like the song goes, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here because the bar is closing. So too with the United States and our borders. Thank God. It's about time that we actually protect our borders and become a real country again. But I digress. So the bottom line is that the three liberals, with a dissent by none other than Justice Jackson, who wrote by herself, all three liberals, Justice Sotomayor and Justice Kagan and Justice Brown Jackson, all dissented in this case, but Justice Brown Jackson wrote an actual dissent that neither liberal signed on to, other than, of course, Jackson herself. Neither Kagan nor Sotomayor signed on to this dissent by Justice Brown Jackson. And specifically what she said is that the Biden administration had repeatedly entered orders that said that there was a humanitarian crisis justifying the creation of this temporary protected status and the application of that temporary protected status, or TPS status, to hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans. And that the lower courts had found that Donald Trump had acted illegally and Kristi Noem had acted illegally in getting rid of this temporary protected status. And therefore, these people cannot be deported yet. And President Trump says, no can do. I should be able to deport these people. I've concluded that Joe Biden's decision that they're entitled to temporary protected status, I don't agree with. And since I won the 2024 election, I am the President of the United States. I was sworn in the Commander-in-Chief. I am in charge of foreign policy in the United States today as the single Commander-in-Chief, and I decide that these foreigners are no longer entitled to this TPS temporary protected status. I get to kick them out and send them home. Goodbye. It's my decision. But Justice Brown Jackson, in her dissent, literally argues that the President of the United States, to the extent there's a governmental interest in the President of the United States kicking these people out, deporting these people, this is something that has to be balanced against the interest of these 350,000 Venezuelans. And that her argument is that the lower courts should be allowed to decide these cases, and they should be allowed to stay in the United States until there's a final judgment and a final appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court on these various topics. But what Justice Brown Jackson does not appreciate is that even the U.S. Supreme Court is an Article III branch of government. They are not in charge of foreign policy. In fact, the one area we can all agree upon, I think even the liberals generally agree upon, is that the President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief in charge of making major decisions associated with foreign policy. It's not clear Congress has much of a say in it at all, except I suppose they could cut the budget of the military or cut the president's budget in other ways. But beyond that, as a general matter, when it comes to determining foreign policy, which includes decisions about who you bring into the country, who you kick out of the country, issues of immigration, issues of visa status, issues of whether or not we should allow 350,000 Venezuelans in the United States by virtue of what the conditions in Venezuela or in the Ukraine or somewhere else in the world, because part of this is, of course, a question of classified information. And what do I mean by this? If you think about who's the one person in the United States that in theory has access to the best information about who is at risk, who is not at risk, what are the real conditions on the ground all around the country and all around the world, and that's the President of the United States. Because presumably, to the extent we have an intelligence service that is intelligent and actually functions, in theory, right, they would know what's going on the ground in Venezuela. They would know what's going on the ground in Russia. They would know what's going on in Europe. They would know what's going on in Africa and Asia and so on. And it's the intelligence service of the United States, the CIA and the like, that is supposed to share this information with ultimately the President of the United States. So the President of the United States can use information, not just information that's publicly available, things that you and I can find out about in the newspaper, but also information that you and I cannot find out about because it's classified or otherwise top secret and shared by the intelligence agencies secretly and quietly to the President of the United States. So who is the best position to determine whether or not temporary protected status is appropriate for any foreigner, included Venezuelans, than the President of the United States, who has access to not just the Department of Homeland Security and all its resources, not just to the FBI and all their law enforcement resources in the United States, but also to the intelligence community, including the CIA. The president is the best position possible of all our government workers to make these decisions. But nonetheless, this is exactly what the U.S. Supreme Court found. The 6-3 ruling in favor of Donald Trump. This is another victory over the deep state. It's another victory over unelected bureaucrats. It's another victory over those people that really want America to fail. That's right. Donald Trump has decided that these 350 some odd thousand Venezuelans should no longer be allowed to stay in the United States. We should start the process of deporting them. They should no longer be protected under this sort of asylum rules, these parole rules, whatever you want to call them. And the decision made by Joe Biden to keep them in the country for up to 4 years during the Biden administration, well, that's come and gone. That's water under the bridge. But Donald Trump doesn't have to follow what Joe Biden is, because remember, the conditions on the ground in Venezuela The conditions on the ground in the United States, the conditions on the ground all across this great country and across the globe, they change. And Donald Trump, as the President of the United States today, is in the best position to assess where are we as a nation, where exactly is our national interest today, and act accordingly. And it's not appropriate for Article 3 judges, including Supreme Court justices like Justice Brown Jackson, to try to step in and overrule the President of the United States on foreign policy. Because remember, the Supreme Court justices don't have access to the CIA. They don't have access to the FBI. They don't have access to embassies on the ground in these various countries. Only the president has that. And that's why historically, the courts in America, the Supreme Court in particular, has deferred extensively to the President of the United States because he is in the best position to make decisions about advancing the national interest. Unfortunately, for the Biden era, they didn't want to advance the national interest. They wanted to throw the national interest under the bus because they don't like America, as far as I can tell. They don't like the United States. They don't like the West. They want us to fall. But Donald Trump, I'm happy to report, is just the opposite. And he is deciding that these people that have come into the country or wanted to come into the country, it's no go. No go. Time to go home or go somewhere else if you don't want to go home. But you can't stay here. And the Supreme Court has just agreed with that exact sentiment and found that Donald Trump is the head of the White House, is the head of the executive branch, and is the commander-in-chief, along with Kristi Noem, his head of the Homeland Security. Guess what? They get to make this decision, and courts cannot second-guess them. And therefore, this stay entered shuts down the attempt at the California courts and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit out of San Francisco to try to thwart foreign policy in the name of these foreigners, where the president says keeping them here does not advance the American national interest. So another big win for Donald Trump before the Supreme Court and against the deep state. All right, that's it for today's episode. Make sure you follow me on X at @4boxdiner. Don't forget to subscribe both to YouTube and to Rumble. And I look forward to talking again real soon here at the 4 Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.